Good morning, everyone. It is a true pleasure to be here this morning. And before I go on, I'd like very much to thank Dr. Nicole Jafari for inviting me here. Yeah, let's hear it for Dr. Jafari. Now, when Nicole first contacted me, I was planning my first trip to Israel and occupied Palestine. And so I gave her sort of this general statement of my intellectual interests, my sort of philosophy of peace and social justice. And we kind of left it at that, and we parted for the summer.
You were in a hurry to get to Israel.
I was in a hurry. I was in a hurry. So the original title of my talk was, "Without justice, global peace will not be attainable, nor will it be sustainable." Now, I take this concept from Mohandas Gandhi, who framed his vision of peace as one in which justice is an inherent and necessary component. He argued repeatedly that peace requires not only the absence of violence, but also the presence, of justice. And when we look at the work of other great social leaders such as Aung San Suu Kyi, Desmond Tutu, Martin Luther King, Elie Wiesel, Eleanor Roosevelt, they all echo consistently the same sentiment. Now, I consider myself a person of peace, as I'm sure everyone in this room considers him or herself. So I decided that this would be an ideal venue to take on a sensitive topic and have a conversation with open hearts and minds, gentleness of spirit, as we talk about this case study that I have selected. Let's see if I can, nope, okay. So my title that I selected was "Without Justice, There Is No Peace, Apartheid and Structural Violence in Occupied Palestine and South Africa, a Comparative Study." I'm on track here now, okay? And so I wanted to talk to you about the comparisons and the parallels that I have seen throughout my years of research. I first went to South Africa. South Africa, just so we all know where we are, is the very, very bottom tip of the African continent there. I first went to South Africa in 1993 and have been back to South Africa off and on over the years and have looked at grassroots political activism and social justice at grassroots levels for many, many years. And so I was excited to go to the Middle East. I'm sure all of you are familiar with this map, and you can see Israel, tiny little place way off there on the west side there. So I spent the last few days putting together this talk, and I was like very diligent, and I had all these facts and figures, and it was like going to be really wonderful. But I sort of looked at it late last night, and I said, you know what? I think this might be a bit dry. Too many numbers, too many statistics, kind of boring. So early this morning, I decided to speak from my heart and tell you stories. So while I will be setting up some terms and some I can't think of the word, be setting up some terms and theories, where I'm basically going to tell you stories and talk to some slides. So what I have changed is the story of my visit, I can't see this, the story of my visit to apartheid Israel and occupied Palestine. So that's basically what you're going to hear today. Before I jump into this material, though, I do want to make a statement about anti-Semitism as well as Islamophobia. Neither one is consistent with a peace and justice advocacy movement. This discussion is not about hate. It's not about judgment. It's not about marginalization of any religious or ethnic group. It is rather a critique of the Israeli government's policy of separation and control of Palestinian Arabs and their land. Now, the media regularly characterizes the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians as a sort of endless cycle of violence caused by centuries, so they say, of mutual hatred. For every atrocity committed by one side, the argument goes, there's an equally brutal one committed by the other. Now, of course, cycles of direct violence cannot be defended. Direct violence is often physical, it's often bloody, it's destructive, it's often deadly. But today, I want to talk to you about another kind of violence. This violence is called structural violence. It's a term that was first used in the 1960s and which has commonly been ascribed to Johann Galtung, who, for those of you who don't know, is the father of contemporary peace and social justice studies. Structural violence is widely defined as the systematic ways in which social structures prevent individuals from achieving their full potential. Structural violence is often invisible to society. It becomes a matter of status quo, sort of the natural order of things, the way institutions in our society keep sort of churning along. Consequently, it is a more subtle form of violence than direct violence, but ultimately, it is just as deadly. So what we can say is that it is a form of violence which corresponds with the systematic ways in which a given social structure or social institution kills people slowly by preventing them from meeting their basic needs. Any form of institutionalized elitism, ethnocentrism, classism, racism, sexism, nationalism, heterosexism, and on and on and on, are just some examples of structural violence. It's because it's when these things become institutionalized that they become the most dangerous. So in other words, when people are socially dominated, politically oppressed, or economically exploited, their lifespans are reduced. For example, studies around the globe indicate that poverty affects access to proper nutrition, healthcare, decent housing, education, and so forth. Essentially, control over such resources and income is based on military, political, and economic power that typically ends up in the hands of a minority who live very well, while those at the bottom barely survive, if at all. So harmful economic systems and institutions are the principal cause of poverty and hunger, and hence shortened lifespans. One might argue that global capitalism, as practiced today with its unequal distribution of basic human needs, constitutes a form of structural violence. Now, when social institutions, such as national governments, oppress and control their people through governmental apparatuses such as the police, the military, the economy, the structure of their educational system, the law, people suffer. Now, one particular type of structural oppression is apartheid, which I have up here on the screen. Apartheid is a phrase that originated in South Africa and means separate or apart, separate, in Afrikaans, which is a Dutch derivative language spoken by the descendants of Dutch colonials who came to South Africa in the 16th century. Now, this is a controversial term when applied to Israel and the occupied Palestine, and occupied Palestine. As you may remember, President Jimmy Carter was highly criticized for using it in 2006. I don't know if you remember how upset people were when he began to use this particular term to what was going on in Israel and occupied Palestine. But I think Jimmy Carter is correct. Palestinian Arabs living in the West Bank and Gaza are living lives of structural violence propped up by apartheid laws. Many South Africans agree because they too lived under apartheid until 1994, when Nobel Peace Prize laureate Nelson Mandela was elected president in the first democratic election in the history of the country. In South Africa, like Israel today, apartheid was enforced through detailed, escalating legislation that violated people's human rights and created a society of misery and violence. It was in effect in South Africa from 1948 until 1990, when internal resistance and international sanctions contributed to its downfall. This is a map that's sort of indicative of apartheid South Africa. I don't know if I can you hear me if I step away from the mic, okay? Okay, good. This is a map of what happened with the landmass of South Africa under the apartheid government. You see those little sort of islands of land, and they're in the different colors. Those were the ethnic homelands. In other words, each ethnic group, indigenous group, in South Africa, such as the Zulu or the Xhosa or the Tswana, were designated to live in a particular area of the country. And remember that this is 20% of the population is white. The rest of it are people of color. And these are the people, 80% of the population is shoved more or less into these little homelands. And they were very clever. They seemed to really figure out where the crappiest land was, the least viable land, and that's where these people were told that they had to live via the law. So at its heart, South African apartheid was institutionalized racism based on an arbitrary classification system that described 4 racial groups within a hierarchy of access to resources. So you had the white Europeans, of course, and the white Europeans at apartheid's height owned 95% of the wealth of the country, okay? Then you had the colored, which were, and these are terms that are apartheid terms, okay? These are terms that are not used today. The second group was colored, which was mixed African and European. The third group was Indian, which was considered South Asian and Malay. And then the fourth was the black indigenous Africans. Now today we see a disturbingly similar system developing in modern Israel. Like the South African example, it is a system of separation between people defined by the state as either Israeli or Arab. It's implemented by laws, it's enforced by the military, and restricts access to resources for a targeted group. On May 15, 1948, Israel declared itself a nation state with a territory slightly larger than New Jersey. And I wanted to put this up because when we start talking about the numbers of peoples that you find in given situations, this is a landmass the size of New Jersey. That's one of our smallest states, right? So keep that in mind. When we say, 1,000 or 2,000 people, it's a considerable percentage of, the population living in this small region. So this Independence Day is celebrated each year in the Jewish community. But for the Palestinian Arabs, the day was called Al-Nakba, or the Day of the Catastrophe. During this time, over 530 Palestinian villages and towns were depopulated and mostly destroyed. 700,000 Palestinians were displaced, some by forced relocations by the Israeli military. Some fled out of fear and became refugees. Some continued to be internally displaced persons. And when I say internally displaced persons, I'm talking about walled refugee camps within the area, okay, where people must stay. They're not considered citizens. They're just refugees, but they're inside the country of Israel. Others live as externally displaced persons living in foreign countries with no right to return to their homeland. Today, several generations live in these camps I just mentioned and have never been able to leave. Now here we have a map showing the Palestinian loss of land over time. And it's really pretty striking when you see it laid out in this particular way. There can be no denying the fact that the Israeli government has created an ongoing strategy of exclusion. Many human rights activists and advocates are calling it an ethnic cleansing project. And it rests on a series of complex laws and regulations, like that of apartheid South Africa. Now, just to give you an idea, this is a kind of not a very clear slide, but it's a slide of a South African passbook. And you were issued this passbook upon your birth. You were designated in your racial category just by the government officials. And you had to have this on you at all times. If you were going to move from one area to another area, it had to be stamped and approved by government officials. Now here we have a soldier playing cards with some Palestinian ID passes, and it's the same kind of a situation where people must have these passes on them at all times. They can be stopped at any time by the military, and if they are outside of their regulated designated area, they can be arrested and put in prison, and they are, we should say. Okay, so like apartheid South Africa, these laws and regulations restrict where people can travel, where they can live, which roads they can travel on, who they can marry and live with, whether or not they can get medical care, what kind of a job they can hold or not, what kind of access they have to education, what kinds of access they have to food and water. The restrictions are enforced by an elaborate system of military checkpoints. Okay. Here's one of the checkpoints into Jerusalem. There are 600 checkpoints in the West Bank alone. 600. Okay. This is just to give you an idea of apartheid and the sort of parallels that I'm drawing. These are some of the public postings in South Africa that were related to the Group Areas Act, which restricted certain people going to certain areas. So the beaches were reserved for whites only. Here you see a picture of a sign that I took just, in August, cautioning, again, under the Palestinian Third, the entrance for Israeli citizens is forbidden, dangerous to your lives, and is against the Israeli law. So in other words, once you get into the Palestinian areas, it's illegal. It's illegal for you to go there if you're Israeli. And they're telling you that you'll be killed. It's a dangerous place to be. Okay, so they're enforced by this elaborate system of military checkpoints, forced removals and home demolitions, government-issued identity documents and passes, the apartheid wall, and regular military and Jewish settler raids on communities designed to terrorize and dishearten them, with the hope that they will emigrate out of the country and leave it a pure Jewish state devoid of non-Jews. Okay, here's some more, another sign. This you can begin to see the settlers. The settlers are Jewish people who are going into the Palestinian territories and just setting up big communities. They're kind of like big walled communities because they're afraid of the Arabs, they're afraid of the Palestinians because they know that they're essentially taking their land. And this just shows sort of Jerusalem and how it's just creeping out into Palestinian areas. Okay, Jeff Halper. Jeff Halper is an international human rights activist, and he defines the apparatuses of the apartheid Israeli state as a matrix of control. And he points out that nearly all of the control mechanisms are in violation of international law, including the Fourth Geneva Convention, which was signed by Israel itself. So some of these matrices of control include massive expropriation of Palestinian land. And this has happened through construction of more than 200 settlements, these new walled communities, little towns, if you will. And basically what you've seen is 400,000 Israelis come into Palestinian areas. You have about 200,000 in the West Bank. You have another 200,000 in East Jerusalem, and you have 6,000 in Gaza. Gaza is interesting because, as you may not know, it's the strip that runs along the Mediterranean Ocean, and the 6,000 Israelis that live there occupy about 25% of the land, and they have all the prime land, or most of the prime land, along the shore. In 2012, a total of 600 Palestinian structures, including schools, hospitals, and businesses, were demolished by the Israeli authorities, including at least 189 homes. 880 Palestinians, half of whom were children, 468 of them were children, were forcibly evicted from their homes and subsequently displaced. Another 4,102 people were otherwise affected due to demolition of structures like animal shelters where they would keep their, these are pastoralists where they keep their animals, or other structures related to their livelihood, or destruction of infrastructure, including roads and access to water. Now, these kinds of practices violate the right to adequate housing that's enshrined in several bodies of international human rights law created by the United Nations. These include the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and general comments of the United Nations Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. So there's a lot of violation going on here. Israel's policies and practices in occupied Palestine may also constitute inhuman acts, as they are defined in Article 7 of the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, as well as a violation of the United Nations Convention on the Suppression and Punishment of the Crime of Apartheid. Now, an additional strategy of land acquisition is to sort of slice and dice, if you will, the occupied territories. What is done is the government will legally designate certain areas that they desire as nature reserves, as closed military areas, as security zones, and as open green spaces, which they then say have restricted housing. Okay. So this effectively restricts or combines the Palestinians to 190 isolated islands of land, these little pockets of land that they've managed to hang on to, that's all surrounded by Israeli settlements, roads, and these checkpoints. Now, one of the things that the government has done, as I said, is sort of slice and dice, is they have developed this massive system of highways and bypass roads. And what they're designed to do is link these Israeli settlements out in the occupied territories to each other. Okay. And these are modern, contemporary, beautiful paved highways. Now the thing is that Palestinians are not allowed to drive on them. They're not allowed to cross them. And how they're designed is they will oftentimes bisect Palestinian land. So they will separate the village from, say, the agricultural lands. So they'll put the highway right through. Here's the village. Here's the agricultural lands. The Palestinians aren't allowed to go over there. Now, certainly they sneak and try, but by law, they're not allowed to go cross the highway because they can't go on the highway. And after a period of time, the Israeli government then calls this agricultural land untended land and confiscates it. 2 minutes? Okay, all right.
So the question period, so when we'll see.
Okay. Okay, when you travel around in the different villages, these kinds of posters you see all over the place. They are the freedom fighters that have been killed by the military. They're everywhere, honoring these people. So the question was, do I think that the conflict is more land related or more religious related? Yeah, you know, there's not one reason for any of it. It's very complicated. There's layers and layers and layers of issues and histories. What basically you have is two conflicting narratives about the region. You have, on the one hand, the Israeli narrative, which is this aggressive side of the Israeli government, this determination to take this land is based in a very conservative notion of Zionism, that land is ordained to belong to them by God. So there you have, you know, a religious belief that's driving some of this. At the same time, you know, Jews and Muslims lived together successfully for centuries. There was never a problem. And actually, originally, you know, it was kind of like, oh, okay, more people are going to come back. Let's see what we can do, was the Palestinian sort of response. But of course, we know that the Arab countries surrounding Israel got very anxious and a war broke out and things, you know, sort of deteriorated from there. But like I say, it's two contested narratives that don't fit together. And until there is some way to integrate these into some sort of connected fabric, I don't know how it can be, you know, resolved. These are some of the house demolitions or remnants of house demolitions that we saw while we were there. These are tear gas canisters. We went to one particular village and they were scattered all over the place because people picked them up. The Israeli soldiers use tear gas regularly on these Palestinians when they're demonstrating. And I can't stress enough how peaceful these people are. They are truly committed to non-violent resistance. So they get out and they demonstrate. They line up, they walk around, they push boundaries. So they get shot at with these tear canisters. Now, it is against international law to use these tear canisters you know, in direct line with humans. In other words, you're not allowed to shoot them at people, but they do it all the time. So there's kind of some different, I wish I had put a picture. There's one kind of wonderful picture going around the web right now. Some woman took a whole bunch of these canisters and set them up in rows of like 15, and there's about 20 rows, and she planted flowers in each one of them as, you know, as a peaceful demonstration. Soldiers, always soldiers. Soldiers are everywhere. This is Hebron, which is a small Palestinian community. Hebron, if you don't know, is quite well known because the basically it was all of the businesses, all of the housing were closed down. The Palestinians were pushed out, and right now you're not even allowed to go in there. We wanted to go in there, and the soldiers wouldn't let us. But it's like, but there's nothing there. Why can't we go walk around? You know. Another soldier here. We were there actually with, just stay by the mic. We were there with a local guide who was a local activist known to the military, known to the Israeli military, and he was showing us around Hebron. And when we got to this section of the city, the soldiers stopped us and they wouldn't let us pass. And so we're saying, well, why not? You know, like, why can't we pass? And they just said, because you can't. You just can't. And so our group leader who speaks Hebrew, he went over and started asking the soldiers, like, what is the problem? Why can't we go? We're a peaceful group. We're tourists. We just want to look in the area. And as we were standing there, behind us, a couple of trucks of soldiers just kind of came into position. Now, they didn't do anything. They didn't threaten us, but they appeared. You know, it's a form of intimidation, even if nothing is said or done. Finally, these soldiers backed down and said that we, the tourists, could go into this area, but our guide, our local guide, could not. So none of us went in solidarity with him. More police. They're just, these soldiers are everywhere. Qalandia Checkpoint is one of the most infamous checkpoints. It's one of the largest checkpoints in the area. And it really is like cattle going through. We went through that turnstile. That's not a picture that I took, but that's the turnstile we went through. You walk down these corridors that are, like fenced off, and they're so narrow when you get up close to where the soldiers are actually going to talk to you that you can't pass another person. So it's just like cattle in that you're in this sort of little jailed, barred tunnel, and you just have to go through. When we went through, we were obviously tourists, obviously Americans, and the soldiers were just barked at us, kind of horrible. Okay, and of course, the apartheid wall. You see it over there on the left where they're still constructing it. There's a lot of graffiti on the apartheid wall. I mean, that's backing right up into somebody's garden right there. And that's like a police tower, an observation tower. Gaza, let me just say one quick word about Gaza. Gaza is completely sealed off right now, and so it's being called the Warsaw Ghetto. People are not allowed either in or out of it. We went over to the checkpoint, but of course we couldn't enter Gaza. One of the apartheid policies about Gaza is some bureaucrat has actually sat down and calculated the estimates of the population in there, so adults and children, and then has calculated how many calories are needed on the average, for these numbers to survive in terms of food, and they only allow, based on this calculation, 1,700 calories a day per person. Now that's, hardly enough. Now obviously adults are going to get more, kids are going to get less, but it's really pretty desperate in Gaza right now. So.
Please, let's give Dr. Stevens a hand.
Thank you so much, and I apologize for going over time. I have so much to say and so many stories to tell, and I would be happy to talk with anybody about it after the conference is over. Thank you so much.